Well, thank you very much, Roland, for the introduction. Good evening, everybody. I'm Martin Whitaker. I'm CEO of Diurnal. I'm joined here this evening by Richard Bungay, our CFO, who's in the front row. And it's been about a year since I presented Diurnal to this audience in London. And in that time, it really has been a transformational year for Diurnal. We've become one of the few UK biotech companies that's actually taken a product from concept through development into commercialisation, and we're generating revenue. That product is Alkindi. I'll talk about that product in a minute, and it's now generating revenues in excess of £1 million in its first year of sales. So just to recap in terms of Diurnal and who we are, this is our company snapshot. We floated on AIM at the end of 2015. That's our current share price. We have a market cap around £25 million. We have a strong cash position as of the end of the calendar year 2018. And since then, that's been strengthened. We announced last month a raise of £5.93 million. And also we had some R&D tax credits of some £2.2 million come into the company since our year end. We have no debt, and we have long-term investors that are very experienced in biotech, and investors such as IP Group, Development Bank of Wales, and Polar Capital. We also have a very strong management team. We have Peter Allen as our chairman, who's led numerous companies in this sector through to exit. My experience is in developing and commercialising products. Richard Bungay's experience is in business development as well as financial. And finally, we have our founder, Professor Richard Ross, Professor of Endocrinology at Sheffield, on whose research the company is based. And now that we're in the commercial setting, it's actually his network of key opinion leaders that we're marketing to very effectively across the world. So in terms of the sector that we're focusing on, it's the endocrine sector, and I would say endocrine, that means hormones. It's a very big market opportunity. It's over $10 billion per annum. And initially, we're targeting a small sector of that opportunity of one specific hormone, cortisol, and specifically diseases of cortisol deficiency. And that's estimated to be greater than $3 billion market opportunity, both in Europe and in the US. And what we want to do in this sector is to develop real high-quality products that address unmet patient needs. We have two products. Our first product is Alkindi, which is for children. That was successfully launched in Germany and in the UK in 2018. And as I mentioned, is generating revenues for the company. It's approved in Europe, and we have the sales and marketing infrastructure in place for commercial launches across the rest of Europe, which is currently ongoing. Our second product is called Chronocort, and that treats adults with cortisol deficiency, and that recently completed its pivotal phase 3 trial in Europe at the end of last year. And recently we got given a go-ahead from the European regulator, the European Medicines Agency, to submit our dossier for registration in Europe for Chronocort. The opportunity that we see for both of these products is actually the way that the products are prescribed. So if you suffer from diseases of cortisol deficiency, you'll usually be treated at a specialist centre. These tend to be large university-type hospitals. And to put some numbers on that, there's around 17 such centres in the UK. And if you look at the European Big Five countries, that's the UK, Germany, France, Italy and Spain, there's around 120 such centres. So therefore, the opportunity for Diurnal and for our shareholders is that we can target these centres with a very modest sales force, perhaps 20 or 30 reps at peak. For the rest of the world, we're seeking commercial partners in the US. We've already entered into marketing and distribution agreements in Israel, Australia and New Zealand. Our commercial exclusivity is based around what's called orphan drug exclusivity. So the diseases that we deal with are rare or orphan diseases, and with those come certain regulatory privileges. So if you are the first to market in these areas, you have 10 years market exclusivity in Europe and 7 years market exclusivity in the US. And we hold the orphan drug designations for all diseases of cortisol deficiency, both in Europe, the US, and most recently in Australia. Secondly, our exclusivity is underpinned by a wholly owned diurnal patent portfolio, which is now granted in most major territories around the world, and that extends that market exclusivity all the way out to 2034 for both of our products, Alkindi and Chronocort. Our focus is very much on developing our late-stage products. However, we do have an earlier stage product pipeline, which is now coming through clinical trials, and we'll talk about that more in the months to come. So with those attributes, it's our vision to become a world-leading specialty endocrinology pharmaceutical company. And the opportunity, as I mentioned, is all about addressing unmet patient needs in the endocrine space. So just a brief recap on what the endocrine system is. So the endocrine system is a collection of glands that produce hormones, which are the chemical messengers that regulate a number of vital functions in the body, ranging from growth, sexual development, and metabolism. If things go wrong and you lack hormones through disease, through ill health, or through genetic causes, then you need to have that hormone replaced, often for the rest of your life. And often the diseases that we deal with are chronic disease, lifelong diseases, which have serious health impact for patients. The hormone that we've all heard of in the endocrine space is insulin, and the disease is diabetes. And as you can see from this diagram, actually all the major pharmaceutical companies have focused their efforts over the years on diabetes. It's a huge market, some $50 billion per annum. Actually, if you look beyond diabetes, and at Diurnal we spend a lot of time speaking to patients, physicians outside of the diabetes area, we've identified a multitude of diseases, seen here on the right-hand side of the Venn diagram, that are going unmet. And these are rare, paediatric, chronic diseases where Diurnal operates and where we see real opportunity. And one of the opportunities is actually this, the competition is very low in this space. There's only a handful of smaller type companies similar to Diurnal that usually pick off one or two of these diseases and take products through to either end of development or sometimes through to commercialisation. And what we've shown at Diurnal is we can take those products all the way through to commercialisation at very low cost. Being mindful of our size, we can't tackle all of those diseases at once, and this slide just highlights our very focused development pipeline. As I mentioned, our focus is on our lead products, Alkindi and Chronocort. Alkindi already approved, Chronocort not far behind. And then we have a longer pipeline of other products which are now coming into the clinic. So for example, we have an oral native testosterone that's just completed a phase 1, phase 2 clinical trial at the University of Sheffield. That will read out in the second half of this year, a very big market. And then we have a couple of other earlier preclinical assets, a T3 modified release program for treatment of hypothyroidism, a very common endocrine disease, particularly in women over 60, and an oligonucleotide therapy for treatment of Cushing's, which is cortisol excess. But what I'll do is I'll focus on our two lead products. And these, as I mentioned, are all around cortisol. And cortisol is an essential hormone for life. Without cortisol, you will die. And for patients who are unfortunate enough not to be able to produce cortisol, they need to be replaced with cortisol, usually in its synthetic version, hydrocortisone, for the rest of their lives. And patients with cortisol deficiency are at risk of fatigue, depression, and death through what's called an adrenal crisis, when you do not have enough cortisol on board to fight off an infection, for example. Two main causes of cortisol deficiency. There's an acquired form called adrenal insufficiency, and this is where you lose the ability to produce cortisol during your lifetime. The two main causes of that, the first is what's called Addison's disease, which is an autoimmune disease where the body destroys its own adrenal glands based just above the kidney. Typical onset, 20 or 30 years of age. Second cause of adrenal insufficiency is a disease called hypopituitarism. It's caused by a benign tumour in the pituitary gland just behind the brain, and that affects the signalling from the pituitary down to the adrenal glands, turning off cortisol production. Typical onset, 50 or 60 years of age. Typical symptoms of adrenal insufficiency: chronic fatigue. These patients literally do not have the energy to get out of bed. 50% of patients can't work and are at risk of this adrenal crisis and death. There is a second cause of cortisol deficiency, and that's a genetic disease called Congenital Adrenal Hyperplasia, a bit of a mouthful, or CAH for short. And this is where patients have a genetic defect which causes an enzyme block in the body, which means they cannot produce cortisol from birth. And this has real issues for patients. They have two key issues and symptoms. One is the chronic fatigue, so they have this suffered from as with adrenal insufficiency patients. And the second issue they have is a build-up of potent sex hormones or androgens in the body, which cause damage to the body. And these are the building blocks of cortisol, and because of the enzyme block, they cannot be converted into cortisol. They buzz around the body, causing damage. So, for example, if you're a little girl born with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, you've got all these testosterone molecules in your body. Little girls can be born with ambiguous genitalia, so little girls look like little boys and may require corrective surgery at some time during their life. For both little boys and little girls who go through puberty incredibly early on in life, perhaps the ages of 5 or 6 years of age, so they grow very quickly as young children. But when it comes to the teenage years where puberty should occur, actually growth is turned off, so you end up being shorter than normal adults. And in adulthood, complications continue in terms of metabolism, fertility, and ultimately this patient group will die some 7 years younger than the normal patient population. The way that these patients are typically replaced is with the drug hydrocortisone, which I'm sure everybody's heard of, and that's the synthetic version of cortisol. And the way that hydrocortisone is administered to these patients is orally, so we need to take a tablet or a capsule each day for the rest of their lives. However, the treatment options here are very much suboptimal, and as I mentioned, the patients have very poor outcomes. And we passionately believe at Diurnal that for the first time we can treat these patients effectively with our products, Alkindi, from birth and moving on to Chronocort in old age. As I mentioned, it's a very favourable competitive landscape. This has very much been a neglected area for well over 60 years. We only have one other competitor in the European market. It's only for adrenal insufficiency, the product's Plenadren. It's not very well prescribed, but it has provided us with a reference price in the market of around $6,000 per patient per annum, and that's a target price point which we are at least seeking to achieve in Europe and have achieved with our first product, Alkindi. In the US, we don't have any competitors on the market. At the bottom of this slide, there's just a handful of competitors in development. We're well ahead of these guys. Most of these guys are still early on in their clinical trial cycle, where we've completed our phase 2 clinical trial in patients and are about to start a phase 3 trial in the US subject to funding. So a very favourable competitive landscape for us. I'll now focus down on the two individual products, starting with Alkindi and then moving on to Chronocort. So Alkindi is a major breakthrough in paediatric adrenal insufficiency, including the genetic disease. And although hydrocortisone was discovered some 60 years ago and made available in tablet form, actually there's been very little innovation in this sector since then. And what children have been taking from birth of this life-saving medication is what you can see on the right-hand side of the slide. It's compounded or crushed adult medicine, so it's either compounded in the pharmacy or parents are given 2 spoons in a tablet and asked to crush the medicine for their children. And this is what's given from birth for these young children in the 21st century. And this is just not fit for purpose in this day and age. And no one has ever applied for a license for hydrocortisone for children under 18 in Europe and under 16 in the US, and we are the first company that now holds the license to treat these children from birth to 18 in Europe. These are the licensed UK packs, which are available throughout the UK. And this medicine is available in paediatrically acceptable format and doses of 0.5, 1, 2 and 5 milligrams. And it can be tailored to the child as it grows. When hydrocortisone is crushed, it's intensely bitter. We have taste masking around the granules that the children take. They're compatible with a wide variety of foodstuffs, and like I say, very easy to administer. In terms of how we've addressed this opportunity, which is around a $63 million opportunity in Europe alone, the basis of approval is called a PUMA market authorization, which stands for Pediatric Use Market Authorization. very similar to the orphan drug. That gives us 10 years market exclusivity in Europe. So we have market exclusivity all the way out to 2028 in Europe, and then beyond that we have patent protection to 2034. As I've mentioned, successfully launched now in Germany, launched in the UK and launched in Austria, and other territories are beginning to follow now across Europe. With pricing agreed in all those territories listed there, and launches will follow very shortly. The other good thing about the way that we've tackled this opportunity is in terms of our marketing and sales infrastructure. We've now established that for Alkindi, and it's exactly the same marketing infrastructure that we use for Chronocort in due course. So we're adding a second product to a rep's bag without any additional cost to the company. In terms of Chronocort, our second product, this is for the treatment of adults. And in adults, the treatment of particularly the genetic disease CAH is slightly different to that in children. In healthy adults, there is a very distinct circadian or about the day rhythm of cortisol, which is shown here in the orange line about the day. It's very low at night, enabling you to get to sleep. It then begins to rise from around 3 o'clock in the morning, giving you a peak on waking, and then gradually decreases throughout the day. Physicians have understood the importance of this rhythm in daily life and have tried to replicate it using standard treatment regimens, using hydrocortisone tablets seen here in red. And the issue is for these patients that the CAH patients that have a genetic disease, they don't have this rhythm, it's flat line, and they need to be replaced. The current treatment regimens, not very effective. You're overtreated at certain times of the day, undertreated at other times of the day, but importantly, there is no overnight coverage of cortisol, which you can see on the left-hand side of the graph. And this is really important for these patients, because it's overnight that these androgens, these sex hormones, begin to rise, again, peaking on waking and causing damage to the body. So if you take your standard medication, it's already too late. The damage has been done to the body, and this is repeated day in, day out for the rest of your life. So we developed Chronocort, which is a modified release hydrocortisone. It's given in what we call a toothbrush regimen, so you take it last thing at night, first thing in the morning. It's the same product, it may be a different dose strength. And the features of Chronocort are that after you've taken it, there's no release of Chronocort for about 3 hours. Then it begins to release and rise, giving you that peak on waking. You take your second capsule in the morning. That's got the same release profile, and that provides you with coverage into the afternoon. And the important thing that we saw with Chronocort was when we tested it in patients in the US, was that on standard treatment of care, so it's hydrocortisone and generic steroids, at best only 31% of patients have their androgens, these sex hormones, controlled into the optimal range. When switched to Chronocort, in our first study, 94% of patients after 6 months of Chronocort had their androgens in the optimal range. We then carried out a larger study. This was the pivotal study which I mentioned earlier. And again, we saw that Chronocort, here shown in blue, controls your androgens across the whole 24 hours. So androgen level on the y-axis, note it's a logarithmic scale, and then you've got the clock time here over 24 hours. And what the regulator wanted us to achieve was to get Chronocort levels between this blue line and this grey line here, which you can see that we achieve over 24 hours. Whereas the standard of care escapes in the morning period, and we saw some statistical differences there between the two arms. Unfortunately, in terms of the primary endpoint, which was a pre-specified endpoint, that was not met. That's for a couple of reasons. But the main reason was that we used quite a complicated statistical methodology called standard deviation score, which in essence was an average of an average of an average. And we didn't see the difference between the two arms on this statistical score. We paused, we went to the European regulator, we talked to them, and we had written feedback in April of this year to say that they understood that it was a statistical issue with a clinical trial design rather than a data issue. And the reassuring things, or the reassuring data around Chronocort was that it achieved significantly better control of the androgens. It was significant, it was less variable than the standard of care. We achieved Chronocort with fewer dose adjustments to the patients, which is better news for the patient. There were more episodes of unexpected therapeutic benefit with the patients on Chronocort, fewer sick day rules, and importantly, we had no adrenal crisis, no hospitalizations with Chronocort at all. So in terms of summary for Chronocort, we see this as a very significant opportunity just for genetic disease in Europe. We've carried out the largest ever study carried out in this patient group, and we've got a green light from a regulator to submit our dossier for market authorization, and we'll do that at the end of this year. And subject to that going through positive review, we should have a positive opinion from the EMA around the end of 2020. In terms of the rest of the world, we're seeking a partner in the US. Again, that's a significant market. In Japan, we've recently had our patents granted for both Alkindi and Chronocort. Again, it's a very significant market. It's the third largest pharmaceutical market in the world. In Australia and New Zealand, we've now had the orphan drug designation in Australia. The market authorization submission is imminent, and in Israel we submitted our market authorization earlier on this year. So by the end of 2019 we anticipate we'll have 4 global regulatory filings worldwide, and hopefully these products will be, Alkindi will be available to patients shortly thereafter. The slide just summarises the key value inflection points over the next 2 to 3 years. We're progressing in Europe with Alkindi and Chronocort. We're seeking a partner in the US. And importantly, if we achieve market authorization in Europe with Chronocort, then we've had feedback from a regulator that with the same product, no additional trials, we can actually target the much larger adrenal insufficiency market, which is running into nearly $2 billion per annum. So we see that as a very large medium to long-term opportunity sometime around the end of 2022. So the outlook for 2019, I think, is a very exciting one. There's been lots of activity at Diurnal over the past 12 months. In terms of upcoming news flow, we have our full year results coming up in September. We have our remaining 2 market authorization submissions coming up by the end of this year, and further news through into 2020. So to summarise, we're building a global endocrinology specialty pharma company. We have established a strong base in orphan diseases. We have a credible market access strategy, which has been demonstrated by our first product, Alkindi. We've got opportunities in the pipeline to broaden our offering, and a strong team to deliver. And thank you very much for your attention.